Welcome to the lecture on the brief history of global health. In this lecture, we will talk about the following. I will give you an overall history of global health through the developments of the following. Colonial medicine, which introduced new diseases to populations. Next, we will discuss the therapeutic revolution, where we saw the Western biomedical model dominate the global health and development discourse. I will discuss historical eradication efforts to eradicate malaria and smallpox, and discuss why one effort was successful and one was not. We will discuss the primary healthcare movement and the Declaration of Alma-Ata. And finally, we will discuss a failed development effort as well as current global health and development contexts. So first, before we begin talking about colonialism and its effect on global health, I do need to define colonialism. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. Essentially, it is the dominance of one nation over another with the ultimate outcome for the colonizers to have economic gain. A lot of this occurred because Africa was rich in natural resources, which the colonizers saw as prime for exploitation and control. Much of Africa and some Caribbean nations were colonized during the 18th and 19th centuries. This map shows a breakdown of African countries and how they were claimed and colonized by various European powers from the period of 1885 to 1914. As you can see, almost every single country was colonized. Many of these countries today still have the language of the colonizing country as one of their official languages. For example, Angola's official language is Portuguese, and almost all of West African countries speak French. Colonialism actually had enormous effects on the health of both indigenous populations and colonialists. First, it introduced new diseases that were non-native to native populations. Second, it facilitated the rapid spread of disease among populations. And third, the enormous wealth and resource extraction prevented native populations from being able to climb out of poverty and disease. Poverty is the single best predictor of ill health, and much of what is now called sub-Saharan Africa continues to struggle today with tropical diseases and health issues that have long since been eradicated from developed nations. So, as populations developed, two main transformations led to the development of epidemic disease. We saw both the growth of cities, known as urbanization, and humans' living spaces being in closer proximity to animals. Often, when civilizations encountered one another, diseases were exchanged between populations that previously had neither exposure nor immunity. As you can imagine, this often had devastating consequences. In the Americas, the indigenous population had never before been exposed to smallpox, measles, or the flu. It is estimated that with the arrival of European colonists, an estimated 90% of Native Americans were killed due to these diseases that the settlers brought with them. It is said that germs were the deadliest agent of conquest, as diseases killed more people than any type of physical weapon, such as the gun or the sword. Colonialism also changed population densities in a way that made the indigenous populations more susceptible to the disease epidemics that had been brought by Europeans. The creation of crowded urban centers throughout Africa, India, and the Americas provided a breeding ground for infectious disease, such as cholera, tuberculosis, and smallpox. The social transformation that occurred as a result of colonialism, called urbanization, was a clear catalyst for the emergence of epidemic disease. During the colonial era, the subjugation of individuals for profit was the main impetus for health interventions. Any type of public health intervention actually served the interests of the colonial powers. Healthy slaves meant productive slaves, which meant more resource and wealth extraction. It therefore served the interests of the colonial powers to keep slaves healthy. To use the island of Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti, as a case study example, it was estimated that there were 400,000 indigenous people living on the entire island of Hispaniola, which is today modern Haiti and the Dominican Republic, before the Spanish arrived in 1492. By the 17th century, not a single one of these 400,000 had survived. They died from not only mistreatment by the Europeans, but also from measles, smallpox, and tuberculosis. However, Saint-Domingue was the most productive slave colony in the entire world. It became a leading slave port in the 19th century with up to 29,000 slaves brought each year. Haiti is an example of how colonial subjects came to be regarded as investments. Ironically, international medicine and global health were actually advanced because of commercial interests. Colonialism had three lasting impacts on public health. First, this is where we saw the beginning of what we call medical missions, which are still heavily practiced today. Religious missions had been a part of colonialization since the beginning, but in the 19th century, these groups began to incorporate healthcare into their services. In this sense, introducing Western medical care was a way of displacing traditional healers that populations largely used. The focus for these missions was to improve the living conditions of native populations through conversion to Christianity and adoption of Western civilization. According to historian Megan Vaughan, the healing done by medical missionaries was part of a program of social and moral engineering through which Africa would be, quote-unquote, saved. The second lasting impact is related to how public health is conceived and practiced today. In the United States and Western Europe, public health has primarily been a state activity and closely connected to protecting the state's interests. In an increasingly globalized world, many of the health concerns with which policymakers are concerned are international health issues. One of the key principles of this international conception has been the idea that the state must protect its citizens from threats perceived to have an external origin, such as infectious disease that can cross international borders. Like during the times of colonialism, international and global health are still today concerned with protecting national security and commerce. Finally, many advances in research have been made in addressing what are considered tropical diseases, such as malaria, yellow fever, and dengue. Tropical diseases are infectious diseases that are found and thrive in hot, humid climates. These advances in research were done almost exclusively in order to protect Western interests. Western nations had military or commercial interests in the areas where tropical diseases were prevalent. Thus, through prevention and treatment, the international spread of disease was curbed and the extraction of wealth was preserved. Moving on to the therapeutic revolution. So for centuries, the ancient Greeks' idea of medicine and disease dominated the medical discourse and medical thinking. The Greeks believed that disease was caused by imbalances in the body. Bleeding, blistering, and sweating were standard practices designed to bring the body back into balance. In the late 19th century, medicine underwent a dramatic change with the discovery of the germ theory of disease. In contrast to the Greeks, who believed disease was caused by imbalances in the body, the germ theory of disease, which we now know to be true today, said that disease was caused by germs. This set in motion the Western trajectory of biomedicine that still continues today. Robert Koch was one such person who set forth Koch's postulates, 4 criteria that are necessary in order to identify the causative agent of a disease. John Snow was another important figure during this time period. Snow is known as the father of epidemiology, epidemiology being the study of human disease patterns, and he discovered that cholera was due to unclean water, not from unclean air, as was the prevailing theory at the time. Finally, Louis Pasteur was another important contemporary. Pasteur discovered, among other things, vaccines for rabies and anthrax. Up through about 1920, the germ theory of disease dominated the discourse. During the early 20th century, the bacteriological paradigm was joined by the recognition of the importance of vector-borne diseases, nutrition, and disease transmission by otherwise healthy people. The therapeutic revolution created a new understanding of disease and illness, which began the trajectory of Western biomedicine. First, diseases were seen as specific and separate, and not caused by vague bodily imbalances, as the ancient Greeks had believed. Second, medicine became part of science, joining the laboratory alongside the traditional sciences. Third, public health had a new foundation as the germ theory of disease was discovered. Germ theory was revolutionary because it changed people's ideas about the meaning of disease. For example, prior to the therapeutic revolution, early 19th century people believed that tuberculosis was contracted by individuals who were highly intelligent. The idea was that individuals were infected because they were too beautiful and smart to live. Koch's discovery of the microbial nature of tuberculosis destroyed this misconception. Tuberculosis soon became seen as a disease of poverty, associated with filthy living conditions and child labor. Thus, social reformers used germ theory to give their cause for reform greater weight. Germ theory gave reformers a new boost and justification for local and global efforts. Finally, the therapeutic revolution began the globalization of medicine. New World herbs and chemicals became prized commodities. For example, it was discovered that one of the properties of Peruvian bark was quinine, which is used in the treatment of malaria. This therefore created widespread interest in the Peruvian bark trade. Overall, this therapeutic revolution gave society faith in medicine. So as I mentioned, in conclusion, the therapeutic revolution gave society a faith in medicine. However, despite the impressive gains that were made during this time period, we put so much focus on the advancement of technology that we forgot to focus on other causes and correlations of disease. Increasingly, since the therapeutic revolution, improvements in health outcomes were tied to advances in biomedical technology. This meant that there was a focus on an interventionist, disease-driven model. This conception struggled to fit with what we call modern diseases, such as obesity. The realization that drugs and technology cannot solve every issue started to shift, as public health has now taken an increased focus on the social determinants of health, which will be discussed in a later lecture. And next, we will move on to part 2 of the lecture.